Over to you, Madeleine, and thank you again for joining us today.
So thank you so much, Anne. It's a huge pleasure, and I really, really mean it. And I'll explain exactly why to be talking to you today. Um, in fact, it's a really sort of significant thing for me to be speaking to you, but for three reasons. And the first is because I did some considerable amount of research in Exeter. Most of the book that I've written, I'm very, very discreet about the geography of the institutions I visited and shadowed. But I think I can just reference the fact that a very important part of my research was in Exeter. And the second reason is even more important, which is of all the subjects I researched, and I'll give you some sense of the scope of the book in a while. But the chapter that I found absolutely intriguing to research was nursing. So I spent time shadowing nurses, I interviewed nurses and interviewed senior nursing academics and read extensively, a very kind of eclectic picking of my way through nursing literature. So some of the sort of the big sort of theorists and historians and so forth. And it was like a whole area opened up to me. And I had never thought so carefully about nursing before, despite the fact that my sister is a nurse, despite the fact that I grew up in a Catholic convent where they expected at least half of their students to become nurses. My cousin became a nurse. I'd never really considered quite the enormous tensions bound up with this profession. So it seemed to me, and the chapter on nursing is right at the center of the book, and it seemed to me that all the issues that I was looking at around the systemic cultural undervaluing and misunderstanding of care all came to a head really in nursing. Nursing is the profession dedicated to care. And therefore, all of the issues I was talking about were so acutely present amongst the nurses that I was interviewing, and how they had to daily negotiate the kind of inner conflicts and the societal conflicts around our misunderstandings and neglect of this hugely important human activity. So to be talking to a group of nurses, people who are not only practicing, practitioners, you've trained as nurses, but you're now taking that study further. I feel that you're absolutely at the front line, and I'm just, sort of quite awestruck. I know it's, one of the old traps, really, that people sort of idealize nurses, but I am quite awestruck, really, about the way in which you're at a kind of cultural fault line. And so, huge respect. And, one of the things that I kind of hoped that the book might do, and I will, talk further about my aims in the book. But one of the aims, and one of the things that's been so gratifying by readers writing to me, is the sense that my book has affirmed what they do, and that carries a great weight. So I hope you get to read the book, and I hope it does something of that for you. And then the third reason is because I feel like I'm amongst friends, because I had a lovely conversation with Anne when we first discussed the idea of me doing this seminar. And then I read her lovely book, which is, I'm sure you've all heard about it, but there's so many points of connection between Anne and I and our thinking. And I love the way she coins the concept of slow ethics from the slow food movement. And of course, I love the phrase, the art of care. I come from a very artistic background. Both my parents were artists. My family are littered with various different types of creative people, actors and so forth. And I do really, really fundamentally believe that one of the misunderstandings of care is we've not understood how deeply creative it is, that it entails much of the creative skills that may go into another, an artistic practice of whatever kind, drama, theatre, artistic, visual artist, sculpture, that it actually curiously sits very comfortably alongside those creative practices in all kinds of ways. And that was one of the things that my interviews with nurses really drew my attention to, both nursing academics and a wonderful intensive care nurse that I interviewed who had a background in drama. So so it's a great pleasure to be here. What a shame I'm not in Exeter itself on a sunny day like this. I could have gone down to the beach afterwards. Um, but let me explain what I was doing for 5 years. My background as a journalist had meant that I had repeatedly stumbled into or chosen to write about care. As a columnist, I wrote about the subject. And so I'd had an interest for 15, 20 plus years as a journalist. And I decided I really wanted to try and move beyond the kind of crisis-ridden narrative of sort of everything's gone wrong, there's a scandal, and then the kind of political commissions, the inquiries, the political rhetoric, this must never happen again, we've got to sort this out, and then the stalemate. That it seemed to me that journalistically I'd covered that cycle too many times. So I was driven by a kind of question, which is there a broader contextual, broader framing that can explain why it is that care gets so often associated with scandal or crisis, with a whole set of problems that we don't seem to be able to tackle. And I will explain a few of those, although they're deeply familiar, depressingly so. So the book was a sort of a standing back, a desire, an attempt to spend a concerted amount of time. And I ended up doing interviews and researching for 4 years, crisscrossing the country in every direction. And I wanted to look at the way care works in very, very different contexts. So I've already mentioned that I shadowed nurses in a hospital, interviewed nurses, shadowed them in a GP practice. But I also wanted to look at GPs and their understanding of care. I wanted to look specifically at the end of life and the way in which all of us, in some way or another, can be called upon to care when a relative is dying. One of the aspects that I think is very, very challenging is that you are suddenly thrown in the deep end. And having just been through exactly that process in the last couple of months, supporting my cousin over the death of her mother, you know, one of the big problems was she suddenly had to learn how to deal with things that you as nurses are trained over the course of a career, handling medications, moving somebody who's very, very frail. So we all get there sooner or later. Some of us don't choose to make a career of it like you're doing, but actually very, very few of us can dodge the demand of care. And you have to be pretty resourceful actually to do that dodging, and it can be extremely destructive of relationships if you decide, actually, I'm not going to go there, I'm not going to do it. So it's kind of, and actually there are many points in our lives when care becomes a very dominant activity, and I weave into my book my own personal experiences of that. Anybody who's had a child, you know, for several months, several years, it can be completely overwhelming. Raising a family, the care that's involved in all kinds of relationships, whether they're neighbours. We're currently cooking meals for a neighbour who's dying, and their family. So as I began to look at this, I began to see the scale of care. It is enormous. It's an empire. And I liked this sort of empire image because I think that care is woven through so many different dimensions of our lives. It takes so many different forms in different contexts, and it has so many meanings. I mean, you know, if you cook a meal for a neighbour who's dying, you could say, well, they can just go to the supermarket and buy a ready-made meal. But I know, and they've made it clear because they've said so on the doorstep, that something about the act of somebody else cooking a meal and putting that thought and effort into it is deeply sustaining at a moment of crisis in their family life. So the first thing that I wanted to do in this book was to provoke curiosity. I wanted people to be interested. What is care? And this became more and more apparent to me because as I was researching, friends would say, well, what are you working on? What's the new book? And I would explain and their eyes would roll and they would kind of like, yeah, oh my God, I mean, really worthy, but a bit boring, no? Philippa Perry, who gave the most wonderful endorsement for the book, the wife of Grayson Perry, wonderful psychotherapist. I'm sure you've seen her on TV. But she was really blunt in her endorsement. She said, this book arrived and I immediately thought, boring. And I couldn't have been more wrong. And I was really glad she put that in the endorsement because that is precisely the attitude that I wanted to challenge. That somehow we've kind of pigeonholed care as worthy and dull. And it was sort of turning that around that was kind of one of the main focuses of the book, which meant that, for example, I took the decision that I'm not going to spend pages and pages and pages analysing the finances, the economics, the budgets of care. I'll do a bit of that, but I'll keep it quite tight. And I'll spend much more time looking at how Philip Roth talks about the care of his dying father, or how Paula Rigo, the artist, paints the pictures in which her sick husband, who was dying of MND. So, here were two extraordinary artists portraying in the 1980s forms of care. I think that they were sort of pioneering something in a way that's not been fully acknowledged, a degree of honesty that we were not familiar with at that point. So curiosity was the starting point. And then, of course, the funny, the bizarre thing is that the book came out in the autumn, in October. And of course, the world had been turned upside down by the pandemic by then. And my kind of starting point in the book was, why is it that this central human activity, which all of us do at some point, and many of us do at frequent points, is so neglected and so undervalued? And then, of course, we were standing on the doorsteps clapping for our carers, and it looked in that sort of moment exactly a year ago, that something really profound could be shifting, that there was a kind of paradigm shift possible. So we live in tumultuous times, that seemed like a rather extraordinary moment when we suddenly realized our valuing of people, the worth of people's work was being turned upside down, because suddenly it was the supermarket workers and the care workers still going to their jobs despite the threat of COVID, the nurses and the doctors still turning up at the hospital, even though they knew they were at risk. There was a moment in which we sort of recognized what they were doing, as opposed to the bankers who earn hundreds of thousands, and all of that argument. Now that moment seems to be disappearing, and the fact that pay settlements have not reflected that enormous labour, etc. So I'm not sure. I think it's still unclear quite whether we will learn the lessons from this pandemic. So just to sort of briefly run over some of the ways, the very, very kind of tangible ways in which care is disregarded. Low pay. The childcare sector is chronic low pay, the worst sector of any part of the economy. The Low Pay Commission repeatedly, every single report, complains about the extraordinarily low pay in childcare. But also, I think that a problem that's probably very familiar to nurses is that for the last 20, 30 years, there's been a continual sort of drumbeat around burnout, stress, workloads that are too high, too heavy, of a kind of dominance of bureaucracy, standardization, an audit culture where one's chasing forms, filling out forms all the time, a process that gets described by by sociologists as work intensification. I could see that in the nurses I was shadowing. They were having to spend so much time on screens. And I think it sets up an inner conflict with their own understanding of what care is. And that was, I think, often acute. What are the drivers for that in terms of an increasingly sort of technical form of healthcare in which there are multiple tests to coordinate and arrange? And then, of course, the care home sector, which has been a huge issue for myself personally over the last year, as we struggle to find my 89-year-old mother appropriate care. And I've recently been sent some work by a young academic into the financialization of the care home sector. And I'm sorry, you've just got to let me kind of rant for a second, because it's a shocking financial scandal, absolutely shocking. And the way in which this is allowed to happen, debt is piled up onto the care home sector, and in a way that enables offshore tax havens to extract huge amounts of money from the taxpayer and middle class families, without any relationship to quality of care, or indeed accessible care. So we have a horrible squeezing whereby those that can't afford it, or those who just happen to live in a postcode where there isn't appropriate provision, are now struggling in ways that have been so evident to me looking after my mother. And so we could go on. You're familiar with this, we all are. So why does these things happen? Why do these things happen? And why is it that we don't really understand care? We don't understand its importance, how much it matters to people. And we certainly can't seem to align the financial remuneration of a wealthy society with how much it can really be appreciated and valued. And that disconnect is really, really fascinating, because actually when you talk to people, they will have very moving and powerful stories of experiencing care themselves. And they will be able to articulate very clearly how much it meant to them. So that somebody who's been in hospital and there was a nurse who held their hand when they were scared, or they were in hospital looking after a child, and a doctor stopped to talk to them and explain things properly. These are daily occurrences, and they are hugely appreciated, as indeed many of you nurses will know, because in the ward coffee room, the tiny little pokey ward coffee room where we got 5 minutes break in the middle of a shift, the walls are covered with thank you cards and piles of chocolate biscuits, and people give back because they know how much they appreciate what they are being given. But yet the systems, political and economic, to reward that and to ensure that people who care are properly remunerated don't seem to be there. So I wanted to, in all the interviews with care workers, with nurses, with doctors, with parents of kids with disabilities, I started the interview with one very straightforward short question. What do you think care is? What is your definition of care? And the answers that came back, it was like a mosaic. It was constantly sort of changing. Every time I did a batch of interviews, my understanding slightly shifted. Because often people would start, well, I don't know. And they would actually prefer to describe an anecdote of an experience of care than to really flesh out a sort of abstract definition. But I also read philosophers of care, and I decided by the end of my research that there was a way to answer this question. And it was three things. It was presence, attention, and touch. All care involves elements of all three. I'm hesitating as I say it, just thinking, can I say all? Let's perhaps come back to that. I really hope that you'll have lots of questions or comments. Um, am I right? Is it always, am I right? Is it always involve presence, attention, and touch? Um, and I loved the way the American philosopher of care, Maurice Hamilton, uh, sort of illustrated that by describing how this is an embodied experience, that care is always embodied. It's how people move, uh, it's how people touch, it's the way their sort of being as they sit. It's not always movement. And that's this point about presence. I remember a friend described, she was in intensive care with her daughter who was very, very sick. And she said, I could tell which nurse was coming into the room by the way they opened the door. That when you're suffering and you're feeling very vulnerable, it's extraordinary how sensitive you can be to people's presence and to recognize the emotional generosity behind a real act of care. The American philosopher Maurice Hamilton started his description of care with an anecdote about washing his daughter's hair. She was a small child in the bath, and it was beautiful the way he described how he felt that in gently washing her hair, so the shampoo didn't get in her eyes, so she wasn't worried about too much water, he was sort of imprinting in a muscle memory an understanding of care that would then serve her in her life. And it was almost a sort of generational, in fact, it was a generational exchange, that in caring for her, he was indirectly equipping her, providing her with the knowledge that she might need in due course to care for her own children. And the fact that also, it goes without saying, of course, that a man could write of this was hugely significant, because the gender definitions around care, I think, are an acute problem, and one that nursing has in particular struggled with. There is no reason why men can't care. And I was emphatic about that. History shows us that when it's necessary, men are just as good as women at caring. And particularly, for example, in war, where soldiers care for each other in many, many contexts. Historically, it's well known. And I drew on the work of Walt Whitman, who some of you may have read, but his diaries of offering care to the young soldiers of the American Civil War. Walt Whitman is the wonderful, wonderful American poet. And he basically invented his own form of care and went into the hospitals daily in Washington in the huge crisis of the American Civil War, which was the world's first modern war, mass casualties, hospitals spilling over in Washington. And this poet took it upon himself to invent care. So the point about Maurice Hamilton is that care is profoundly relational. It is always about human beings and how they're encountering each other. And that is why I think that it's so pernicious to introduce concepts of marketization and commodification. So one of the things that I am recurrently interested in is the language that's used. And my book sort of does a deep dive into various key words. But if one of the banes of my life was when people would talk to me about the delivery of care packages. And it just made the hairs on the back of my neck stick up, because, we've all had experience of delivery of packages in lockdown. Somebody drops it on the doorstep, rings the bell, and they're running back to their van before you've even opened the door. Delivery is not a word that's appropriate for care. I think some part of care is always a gift of self, and that language of vocation, which has always been there in nursing and in medicine, is, I think, very, very relevant, even though it no longer has the religious background that it once had. And that is why the kind of consumer concepts that have also been imported into healthcare are so unhelpful. So the hospital where I was shadowing, had a massive advert right by the main entrance. Care the way you want it, where you want it. And of course, there was a smiley picture and some flowers in the background and an elderly lady looking very happy. That kind of consumer advertising, I think, is pernicious because it makes out that care is, it's incorporating the concept of consumer sovereignty, that the consumer can decide exactly where they want, what they want, and that convenience is the primary um, uh, value. And of course, that I think is deeply disrespectful to a carer. Um, you can't have care the way you want it, where you want it. It's a nonsense phrase, particularly outside a hospital. I mean, we all know that you go to a hospital for a form of expert medical care. So you can't decide you want that expert medical care at home. So you get my drift about how key concepts of care have been undermined by cultural change around consumerization, marketization, and industrialization. But to just, I think we're kind of coming to the end of my introduction, aren't we? And so I'll just introduce one other sort of context framing, and then perhaps we can get into some questions, because there's lots more I can say, but perhaps let's do it in terms of a question answer. So what is the bigger story? Why is it that these what I would describe as pernicious trends have been able to make inroads into our understanding of care? And I would argue that is because there has been an historical structural bias against care. And that has been the case for centuries. And this is where I put my cards on the table. It's patriarchy. And I point to the work particularly of the American feminist economist Nancy Folber, who sums it up brilliantly. And she says that the whole design of patriarchy is to ensure a plentiful, free, or cheap supply of care. And I think it is that sort of central, that there are cultural stereotypes around women being caring, being good-hearted, doing things for the love of other people, rather than having authority, status, power, and money. Those go to men. And what women are supposed to do is become these saintly figures. And Florence Nightingale, of course, the wonderful, wonderful Florence Nightingale, I do think she's absolutely extraordinary and amazing, but she created the gilded cage, which nursing has struggled with, around these Christian stereotypes of self-sacrifice. But industrialization solidified that. The women's realm was private, men's realm was the market, the public sphere, and care became invisible. So we've had 300 years of intellectual history which has barely acknowledged the reproductive processes of society, and the care labor, which is absolutely essential to the sustaining of society. Starting with, Adam Smith. Who cooked Adam Smith's dinner was the title of one book. The answer, of course, is his mother. Nobody knows that, though. And without his mother's cooking, we probably wouldn't have had his great philosophical works. So there's an invisible mountain of labor. That's, in fact, the title of one of Nancy Folber's books, The Invisible Heart. And it's that invisibility, that hidden nature of care, which makes it so vulnerable now to the erosion that I have been describing in terms of cultural trends around consumerization and marketization. If you don't know what something is, then you don't realize the danger around it being profoundly misunderstood, and the cascade of problems that result from it being so misunderstood. So the relative of the patient who stands beside the bed and says, well, I want care the way I want it. Well, you as nursing professionals have learned how you have to negotiate that conversation. And it can be a set of demands which are impossible, simply impossible to meet. But it's you that are the ones that have become responsible for explaining a cultural confusion. And that is why I have such a sort of fascination for your work, and and sort of admiration that you're on a cultural fault line, and you are the ones that often end up having to sort out the problems that come from those misunderstandings. And I've given one example, perhaps we can discuss others. But I think that is part, just, leads us into some of the questions around burnout and stress. If you're on a cultural fault line, you're going to feel the stress because you haven't got the support of the organizations and the cultures around you to do your job. And to just end on one very moving anecdote, I shadowed a healthcare assistant, and she pointed to a sticker on the door that she passes dozens of times a day, and it said, "Care is our business," and it had the 6 C's: competence, compassion. I mean, you'll know all the 6 C's. And she pointed to the sticker and she said, "Care is not a business. I've been doing this job for decades and I do not see it as a business." And I just loved her stout response. She was a healthcare assistant and she had an insight into care that her organization was not affirming or supporting. And I just watched her so patiently help a patient to wash himself, because she'd been told that she had to empower the patient and the patient had to wash himself rather than her wash him. He was a very, very elderly, very confused gentleman. And when she turns around and says, "That's not a business," you have to agree, and you have to think, how is it that somebody who's at a very low level of skill in our society understands something very profoundly that our culture seems to have forgotten?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Madeleine. That was a really great introduction. Lots of provocation as well, I'd say. I think certainly I have lots of questions. I'm going to start just to ask who would like to kick off with a comment or question for Madeleine, please.
Hi, Madeleine. Just interested to know what Philippa Perry said about your comments on care, or your book. I read Philippa Perry's book, the book You Wish Your Parents Had Read, and the one You'll Be Glad That You Will Have Read in the Future If You Have Kids. And I thought it was absolutely eye-opening, and I learned so much from that book. So I'm really curious to know what her opinion was. After she said this is so boring.
Yeah. Well, let me see. I think all we've got is the edited quote. So on the back of the book, the endorsement was, "It surprised me that a book about care could be so compelling because mistakenly I must have filed care under boring. After reading this, I won't do that again. It is so well written. It is a pleasure to read. Thank you, Madeleine Bunting." So, sorry, it sounds like I'm advertising the book. That's what publishers do, is they take a lovely quote like that and then they cut it about until it works for promoting the book. I think one of the things I remember in the full quote was she said, "I think every politician should read this book." So I think she got, my argument about how the misunderstanding of care has led to such a lot of problems. But I'm afraid endorsements tend to be 2 or 3 lines long, and we'd have to have a conversation with her to understand quite why she'd enjoyed it so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Suze. That was a great question to start us off. Thank you, Madeleine. Another question, comment, please.
Could I ask a question, Anne, please?
Of course, Claire, delighted. Go ahead.
Hello, Madeleine. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. One of the things that occurred to me when you were talking is we often talk about formal and informal care. And I just wanted your take on that categorization.
Yes, well, it's a good question. And in a way, I suppose, in my sort of metaphor of empire, I was bringing together formal and informal, and I interviewed both. I'm trying to think. I mean, it's not a very happy categorization, is it? It's not comfortable, because informal somehow sounds sort of secondary, and that's clearly not the case. There can be some extraordinarily skilled carers who become extremely knowledgeable and actually, become brilliant carers. So I mean, I can see there's a sort of pragmatic reason for using the categorization. People who are devising policy end up having to use some quite clunky concepts. So I think yeah, it's a good question, Claire. I mean, it may be that I have a further thought about it. I mean, professionalization has been very, very important in lots of aspects of care, of course. But sometimes I think formal actually, both sides of this divide are ill-served by the categorization, because formal care can sound a bit, formal. And the way in which one is personally affected by care work, that it digs very deep into you, can sometimes get occluded by that language. Professionalism, by definition, is about a form of detachment, but actually many care professionals are profoundly affected at a personal level by their work. So there isn't actually the detachment that is regarded as kind of part of the job. So care, one of the things I looked at was the etymology of care, going back right into the history of the word. And care comes from Old English and Old German around sick bed, and karu is a burden of the heart. And I was quite interested actually at how weighty and painful, the care has always been associated with suffering, so that it takes a toll on the human heart. And perhaps more recognition of that, because that straddles the formal informal divide. Funnily enough, I'm working on a new book, and I was interviewing somebody in Clacton last week on the promenade, and she was a care worker. And the minute she said that, I was like, yeah, of course, because I recognized in her face something I've seen in a lot of care workers, women in their 50s or early 60s who've worked for a long time in the sector, that it's hard, very hard work. And they're obviously not getting paid well, we know that. But I think the hardness of the work is the way in which they have witnessed so much human suffering. And that can often be the case in nursing too. But there's more support in place. Perhaps not enough, but at least there are teams. Care workers are often working on their own, and they're often completely helpless in the face of human suffering. And I could see that kind of exhausted strain on her face of somebody who has felt that. So I was at a very interesting conference in Brighton in December, by Zoom, obviously, where I gave a paper where they were looking at a lot at that formal, informal interface in elder care. That was a good piece of research, because I think it was really trying to sort of break down the sort of hardness of the divisions, and recognizing that actually the way they often get put into a hierarchy is not really very helpful. So those are some rather sort of off-the-cuff thoughts about a very interesting subject. Very interesting question, Claire.
Thanks, Madeleine. And I do agree with you. It's not a question that can be answered in 2 minutes. It's there's so many different levels and so many interpretations and sides. So thank you for that. It was really interesting, and I'll look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Madeleine. Other comments, questions, and excuse me, please just unmute and just and take your camera off when you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. Please just go ahead. I can't see everyone's hand, so that's going to be the most reliable way forward. Thank you.
I was wondering if I could ask a question. We had a talk last month from Joan McCarthy about the sort of crucible of COVID-19 and how that's affected people's perception on the care sector and the sort of hero worship that's come out of that. You talked a little bit about gender stereotypes and gender roles within the care sector and how there's not really a perceived place for men in the care sector, and the sort of on the other side, sort of women have to be this saintly figure who live to serve and to care. And how do you think the sort of increased airtime and sort of view of the care sector that's come out of COVID-19 is going to affect those roles and those stereotypes?
So lots of really good questions there, actually. There's sort of one around what will COVID do? And then there's another question around this gender stereotyping. And then there's a sort of third question, if you like, as to whether COVID might change the gender stereotyping. So they're really fascinating subjects. As I said, I think there's already signs that the cultural and economic forces which devalue care have such embedded strength that they will probably survive COVID. So although, we clapped for the carers, I fear now that is the classic pattern whereby carers get idolized, turned into heroes and saints, but not actually recognized in terms of the kind of hard labor of their work. It's this fundamental problem with how we value things, and how the valuing of a form of care doesn't match up to the economic value and the financial reward. And I wonder sometimes one GP said to me, the problem about politicians is that by definition, most politicians are pretty healthy because it's a very tough job with long hours. So you have to be pretty strong, robust. Most people go into politics probably 20s or 30s and stay in it until, say, 60s. So many of them have not actually had a lot of experience of ill health or vulnerability. And they're the ones who get to make the health policy. And this GP was saying, for a politician, the primary importance of a GP is that they're accessible and convenient to reach. So that's why they want, 7-day surgeries and walk-in clinics. That's why the politicians have been obsessed with that issue for years. But he said, if I look at the people turning up in my clinic, convenience is irrelevant. A huge number of them have chronic conditions which require careful management over years and years and years and years. So the politician's agenda when it comes to healthcare is at odds with actually what's required. And I do think there's a distortion. We've had a political system dominated by men, so that means that there's that misunderstanding. They don't actually do a fraction of the amount of care that women do. And then we've got a political system dominated by a certain age group. So you can see why these are some of the factors why the system keeps on going the way it is and it doesn't get challenged. COVID has shown us how in a crisis, things can go backwards, not forwards. The surveys indicate that in homeschooling and childcare, women have been picking up a large part of the shortfall. So old cultural stereotypes reassert themselves in crisis. So that's all very depressing. In terms of the gender differentiation, I think the issue coming down the tracks, which will be really interesting, is automation and the impact that's going to have on a lot of very male-dominated professions. So transport and logistics is quite a male-dominated form of employment. While the predictions are that we'll have driverless cars, we'll have lorries that are driverless, some point in the next 20 years, maybe. I'm picking these figures quite roughly. The professions or jobs that are much more secure are care related. And as one very bright, sparky care assistant said to me, aged 21, she said, you know, my job's going to survive. I know people are going to carry on needing care. And she's dead right. You know, she could have talked to the chief economist of the Bank of England, because he says the same thing. Care employment is going to grow, not just be protected from automation, it's actually going to grow as a proportion of the labour force. So at that point, do men start thinking, well, maybe this is an option? I think the thing that really has to change is pay. You know, because men often take on a primary breadwinner role, not always, but often, they are very financially orientated. I mean, this is a, you know, big generalization, but if you look at the labour market, men want jobs that are sufficient to support, you know, or pay a considerable proportion of household expenses. And so if care work gets paid properly, you would see more men going into it. The reason why childcare work is so badly paid is closely related to the fact that it's almost kind of, the gender segregation in childcare is insane. It's kind of almost 99%. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. But that's because you can get paid better in a supermarket than you can running a nursery, which is just, you know, what is that value system about? That somehow looking after 15 children, it shouldn't get financially rewarded more than a supermarket operator. So, you know, manager, sort of the junior level of management. So you know, that I just find an extraordinary analogy, because given how much we value our children, why is it we don't value the people who look after them? So those are a few thoughts towards, you know, what I think is a very, very kind of interesting area. I mean, I think it's fascinating that nursing has made so little progress in desegregating. You know, it's still well over 80% of nurses are women. And, you know, that's not for want of trying. And it was fascinating talking to the male nurse. I mean, you know, I made a point of interviewing many male nurses, and they couldn't understand it. You know, they were like, you know, it's such a fascinating job. Why is it that men don't go into it? And, you know, there's plenty of evidence that they can do it. So, you know, what is that about? And I think it's still about concepts of masculinity that are still very sort of challenged by the idea of caring for sort of frail bodies.
Thank you, Patrick. Great questions. Thank you, Madeleine.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions, please?
Hi, Madeleine. Thank you for that. It's been really great. And coming from someone who's the sister of a very successful trader in London, who's always been the successful sibling, it's been really lovely to listen. I was wondering whether during your research you spoke to student nurses and got some understanding of the culture around student nurses that pay for their education for 3 years and that work on the wards for no salary, when we were talking about the value and the correct payment for the care industry, and what kind of feedback you found there.
Well, that's a really interesting perspective, actually, and no is the answer. I didn't, and it would have been good to have done so. I didn't talk to any student nurses, I don't think. There probably would have been some on the ward, but I'm not sure I would have clocked that. You know, it was quite a very busy ward. So that's a very interesting thing. And also it would have been a very interesting line of research, because what I did do, and in the past I've also interviewed nurses about you know, in the more the sort of 50s and 60s, or, you know, late 40s, that sort of a generation. And one of the recurrent themes they had is the nurses of today are different. And it would have been quite interesting to have tested that out. You know, I mean, one of the problems about writing about a book about care, where you're trying to kind of cover the whole waterfront, is, you know, you're constantly having to think, oh, I've got to sort of hold this together, otherwise I'm ending up writing an encyclopedia. so I had to kind of, sort of, kind of issues that would have really interested me. There were plenty that I had to just sort of say, okay, well, I can't quite cover that or that. But there's a generational conflict within nursing, it seemed to me. I don't know if that's your experience. And perhaps there's always been that, always the older nurses say, oh, they're different. The younger ones aren't quite made of the same stuff as we are. I mean, I'd be fascinated to know what Anne thinks of that. But the perception amongst the older nurses was that the younger ones didn't have the same degree of emotional empathy and compassion, and that they were much too sort of brusque, kind of looking out for themselves. I mean, it was a pretty long list of complaints, and they may be very well educated, but they somehow seem to have kind of lost the heart of it. Yeah, it was interesting, wasn't it? What's your thought on that?
That's what I was just going to ask. Kirsten, do come back on that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd agree that is a perception amongst, I won't say older because I'm probably the same age as some of them, but nurses that have been doing a job a long time and haven't come through the academic route, that they do feel sometimes that nurses now is rooted in academia, which actually I think is really important. And I think that our education brings so much to the role. But yeah, I've definitely heard those comments on the walls.
Yeah, just to pick up on a couple of the points you're making, I think one of the things that's very, very interesting about nursing is that it straddles a dualism in our culture, which is between head and heart. And the idea that it's possible to be both, to have both head and heart. Our culture still, it's almost like people like quite simple categories. And nursing has always, Florence Nightingale absolutely put this central, because she was clearly extremely clever statistician, but she included a kind of, she invented a concept of nursing which was both head and heart. And that's become even more evident in the last few years, I think, with degree level nursing, and I think that's one of the things that nursing has to sort of struggle with, which is that a lot of people still can't quite put those two together. You're either clever or you're kind, but the idea that you can be clever and kind. And the other thing I would just pick up is your comment very briefly at the beginning about your brother as a trader, and he's the successful sibling.
Well, actually, it's a sister.
Sister, sorry, yeah.
That's what...
Well, there you go. I made a stereotype. Yeah. But I think, again, that's where nursing has a kind of, is caught in a cultural fault line, which is, what is success? All of us go through life trying to work out, what does success look like? Some of us accept society's definitions of success, loads of money, lots of prestige, lots of status. And other people have the courage to define their own concept of success. But there's no, and that success could be about knowing you've had a huge impact on somebody else's life. So the wonderful care assistant that I talked to before, 21, untrained, but she said, I know I make a difference to people's lives every day. And my friends who are in the nail parlor, so who wants a new set of nails? What difference does that make? I just loved her. She was just so sparky. She was great. She said, when I go to bed at night, I know I've transformed somebody's day. And, at 21, she had worked out a concept of success. I mean, I really hope she holds to it and can hang on to it, because there's no cultural affirmation or endorsement of that. And that worries me, because, we need the affirmation and the endorsement of these kinds of human values. So thanks. Those are interesting to talk to you.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Kirsten. Thank you, Madeleine. It just reminds me, I do, ever the optimist, things are getting better, but there was a time, there was a flurry of articles on the theme of, too posh to wash, and all of that. But hopefully that is subsiding now, and especially people see the need for knowledge and expertise, skills and values as well. And there's a nice little comment here from Jamie Lee in the chat. She says, success to me is being happy with my own achievements, being happy with the person I've become. Jamie Lee, if you want to ask Madeleine a question, please do just unmute and put your camera on if you'd like to do that. And meanwhile, is there anyone else, please, who'd like to make a comment, ask a question?
I've got a quick question.
Go ahead, Lauren, thank you.
Oh, I'll put my camera on, hang on. Sort of going back to talking about men in industry, I've noticed quite a lot that with sort of these NHS sort of adverts and the Macmillan nurse, they tend to use female nurses as the sort of the reputation. So I wonder what your thoughts were on, do you think that is hindering males going into the profession because they feel that they're not wanted? Because, you know, I find it quite interesting that we're all talking about equal rights and all of this and being fair, yet adverts are being made in the media that is portraying nursing to be a sort of all-female sort of role.
Yeah, Lauren, I think it's a really, really good question. In fact, somewhere it's coming back to me. I saw a sort of history of the adverts used for nursing. And it would make it just the most brilliant sort of, you know, essay, extended essay. I don't know, Anne, if somebody's done it. I guess they have, because each, you know, if you look back over the last 30, 40 years, there've been different types of advertising recruitment campaigns for nursing. And they've presented nurses in very different ways, whether that's, you know, highly technical, quite scientific, white coat, you know, type thing, or whether it's all feely touchy, kind of holding hands and sort of smiley type thing. But yeah, you're right, the vast majority are women. And I think the way those adverts work is very, very powerful. You know, they give people a sense of, okay, this is what a nurse is supposed to look like. And you know, breaking down those stereotypes, getting men to think about it. You know, I think that's a huge part of equal rights. It's not just women getting to do men's jobs. It's kind of opening it up for men to do women's jobs. And you know, it's just I mean, it's quite interesting because I'm married to a man who works in a hospice, who is a carer. So in our case, actually, the roles are in many ways quite reversed. He's much more of a carer than I am. You know, when the kids vomited, he was much better dealing with it, you know, so dealing with the sort of messiness of human bodies, which is part of sort of nursing, you know, he was kind of absolutely brilliant with it, didn't give a damn, you know, it was perfectly straightforward, you just get on with it. So I kind of, I'm not sure I've quite got to the bottom of, you know, partly because I've had a life experience now of being married to a man for whom care is absolutely second nature. I'm not sure I have much insight into why it is that men dodge it so effectively so often, both in their personal lives and then choose obviously not to go into kind of careers. I'm very, very glad that I mean, one of the best moments after the book came out, I was interviewed by the chief executive of the Royal Society of Arts, who is a hugely intellectual character, man in his early 60s, used to be in Downing Street in the policy unit, all the rest of it. And what he said is one of my best comments about the book. He said, Madeleine, I always thought care was just something I would throw money at when the time arrived. If I needed to care for my wife or my child or whatever, I would just pay for it. And he said, after reading your book, I have totally changed my view because I now think to care for somebody else would be a really interesting experience and a really important life experience. And I was like completely bowled over. I was just like, whoa. So, you know, part of the book's purpose is to get men to think again. And, you know, I didn't ever imagine someone like him might think again. You know, do we sort of slowly inch forward on this one? I do think, I don't know about Anne, but I do think sexism is kind of endemic in healthcare. And one of the nurses I was shadowing, I was just gobsmacked at a comment the consultant made to her. I just was like, my jaw just dropped. He made some completely irrelevant comment to her being a part-time model. And then at the end of the shift, I said, well, what did you make of that comment? I mean, she was so busy. She was running a ward. And I said, we didn't have time to ask her about it. And at the end of the shift, I said, you know, what was that about? And she said, I don't know, you know, I haven't got time to be bothered with that. But, you know, she would have been entitled to haul him up and challenge him about that. I don't know how one, you know, the consultant was still being patronizing. You know, she was pretty, and therefore she couldn't be authoritative and skilled and a professional that he could, you know, respect as an equal. No, he could still patronize her.
I mean, I agree. I mean, on my placement, I was quite lucky to work with another student nurse who was male, and it was quite interesting to see how other nurses and doctors and even the patients sort of took to us differently. I mean, I was with one patient and she refused to hold his hand, but was happy to hold mine. I just thought it was quite interesting how we're both the same role, we're both doing the same thing, we're both learning the same stuff, we're both doing the same role, yet doctors would often actually speak to me and instead of this other student nurse, which I found was quite interesting because the male nurse was the one that actually asked the questions, and yet the answer was sort of directed to me. So I thought that was quite interesting, and ever since that I've sort of picked up on, you know, the adverts that nursing, you just assume that you're going to get a female nurse when it shouldn't really be like that.
That's so interesting. And what you're describing is two incidences where the male nurse could have felt very uncomfortable and excluded. So perhaps that's part of why, you know, men get disheartened. That, but of course, you know, looking at it again, you know, it's a very kind of complex scenario where somebody wants to hold your hand, not his. They could have a history that has made them feel very uncomfortable and unsafe around a man. So yeah, it's a very complex one. Did you talk about it with your fellow nurse? Have you?
No, I mean, he was at a different university, and with the patient, I didn't really talk about it because I didn't want to sort of upset him, because he just seemed a bit disheartened that the fact that she'd gone to hold my hand but sort of refused his hand. I could tell, even though he had a mask and goggles on, I think he was a bit disheartened by it. We did discuss the fact that the doctor spoke to me, and I said, oh, I don't know why he directed at me, it was your question. And I sort of felt like I had to apologize. I sort of went, oh, like I'm sorry he spoke to me, but apart from that, you know, we were incredibly busy, so we don't really get much chance to talk about it. But I did feel like I was sort of put in a really awkward position, and I did feel a bit uncomfortable, especially when we were stood there and the doctor was directly just looking at me and talking to me. I was a bit like,
I think Lauren, what you're recounting is fascinating. It's really, really fascinating, because what I would suggest, you know, this is a sort of recurrent theme of this kind of talk that we're having, this kind of whole sort of web seminar, is how nursing is, because it's right at the center of so many fault lines of cultural understandings, you guys are always, in some sense, kind of negotiating those cultural conflicts in your everyday working practices. So that one is the one I hadn't considered, which is how, because of the deep entrenched gender stereotyping around care, you will be kind of encountering it all the time. Now, can you gently question it, shift it, be creative around that? Because there are cases where, you know, people unexpectedly, you know, maybe an elderly lady unexpectedly will discover that the male nurse is a lovely, lovely person, and she didn't realize, and she's so grateful, and there can be an extraordinary moment of connection between them. So it's kind of, how can you be an innovator? How can you help in tiny, tiny ways shift those expectations? And it takes, you know, an incredible self-awareness and awareness and sensitivity to the situation to be able to skillfully do that. You know, as the consultant is talking to you, you turn to your student and, you know, there's a sort of body language where you're including them. But I should imagine, you know, a lot of the time you're getting people's projections as a nurse. You know, they're projecting onto you all sorts of understandings around care. And, you know, some of those are to do with their mothers. You know, this is terribly deep emotional stuff, because when you're vulnerable, all the kind of, you know, really, really old emotional patterns can kick in. So, so thanks very much. It's really, really interesting scenarios that you're describing, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you, Madeleine. Other comments? We've got about 20 minutes, so we've got a bit of time still for comments and questions.
I've got a question, if that's okay.
Of course,
And
Rachel,
a comment,
go ahead.
if that's all right. I'll be cheeky. I've got a comment and a question. Sorry, Madeleine, because I really enjoyed that. That was really thought-provoking and poignant. And I particularly liked your reflections on, I suppose, language, on delivery. And I was thinking about sort of the humanitarian sector and the armed forces and their care packages they often send. And I had never really considered it in a consumerism way before. And so you got me thinking. And I was also thinking about perhaps terminologies around patients, beneficiaries, and sort of all these different languages we use, and the importance of perhaps thinking about that. So that was my comment. Thank you. My question was, and these are really interesting discussions we're having around gender. And I suppose I'm coming in as a mental health nurse, and I've noticed being a mental health nurse, it's by no means balanced, but I've noticed there's more men in the mental health care sector than perhaps there are in other care areas. And I suppose I just wondered what your reflections were, if you thought about sort of mental health care, and yeah, I just wondered what your reflections are from a mental health care angle.
Well, it's a really interesting one, which I noticed as well. I mean, there are two areas of nursing where there is significantly more men than other areas. One of them is intensive care, accident and emergency as well, and mental health. So those are the three areas, I think, if I'm right, Anne, where you'll get a few more male nurses than in other areas. Still female dominated, but well, the mental health, I'm not, you know, a huge expert on the history of mental health, but I do know that obviously a lot of mental health care provision was largely custodial until sort of what, the 60s, maybe 50s, 60s. So that was the idea, that you just had to basically, you know, ensure that these people didn't damage themselves or damage others. And at that stage, that kind of custodial, that, you know, it's a very, very painful history. I don't know whether you did any history modules. You're an academic, actually, aren't you, Rachel? I remember you're a member of the staff.
I am, yes, I'm a
Yeah,
lecturer
so
here.
you'll have done some of the history of this, right? You'll probably know far more about it than I do.
It's really interesting to come in with a different, I suppose, sort of a lens where you've come in to observe, and it's just so fascinating because when you've lived it, it's just so interesting.
So I'm not telling you stuff that you kind of like. I mean, if I'm, you know, telling you stuff you already kind of know, please stop me. But that relationship between the custodial history of mental health and its close relationship, therefore, to prisons as another form of custodial institutions, meant that you got men, largely a lot of men in mental health nursing in the 40s, 50s, you know, and earlier. So, you know, is there a link between that history and the fact there's more men in it, or is it, you know, I'm really out of my depth here, Rachel, or is it something about the fact that mental health is not so bound up with disintegrating bodies of one kind or another, that there's a kind of physicality of the kind of blood and shit and vomit and all the rest of it that means, you know, I'm just wildly guessing now, but I did, you know, I've known friends who are mental health nurses, men who are mental health nurses, and the kind of work they were doing was so closely related to therapy, you know, kind of psychotherapy, and that it sort of fitted a very different type of paradigm of nursing, where there was a lot of kind of talking, you know, forms of talking therapy. And that, of course, is a very, very different type of professional culture. I don't know what the balance and the breakdown is within psychotherapy training as to whether, you know, it's predominantly men or women, but there's certainly a significant number of men, and psychoanalysis, you know, is the great founding fathers of psychoanalysis, Jung and Freud. So, you know, you've got that tradition kind of feeding into it as well, haven't you? Where it emerged as a respectable male profession in Vienna in the kind of, you know, 1900s. So, you know, very complex. And now I've gone so way out of my comfort zone into a totally different area. And I think, God, hell, Rachel, I should have been listening to you.
Great question, and very interesting response, Madeleine. Thank you very much. Other comments, questions, please? Just unmute and put your camera on when you'd like to speak, please.
I'm wondering, Anne, when you get a chance to ask some questions or
well,
comment.
I have, but I sort of feel I'm hoping we'll have another conversation. I don't want to take up the time because there's I'm very keen that other colleagues have a chance. I mean, there are a number of things that have struck me. One is, you know, in the book, reference to vocation, which you've already touched on in your introduction, and the idea of service. And I suppose I just wonder how you square that then with professionalism, because it almost lends itself to, dare I say, exploitation. So I just wonder how you think about that, and yeah, can we square that without it necessarily leading to, I mean, people will always make assumptions, I guess, and will also be stereotypes, but necessarily lead to narratives of self-sacrifice and so on. I mean, I'm not opposed to vocation and service for sure. There's very good reason to have that. Yeah, so over to you, Madeleine, just what your thoughts are on that idea of vocation service and how that we think about a contemporary profession with clearly.
I think it would be a really, really interesting exercise, Anne, whereby one sort of almost visually maps this out. You know, you have a big screen and you put onto it all the different words people use around their jobs. Because the interesting thing is that in the last 20 years, I got fascinated in sort of management theory and how they talked about being passionate about the brand and about the brand having a sense of purpose, and that was essential to motivate your staff. So you got this whole language about passion and purpose, which I was so struck by the religious nature of this language and deeply suspicious, because a lot of it was in big corporations. So, you know, Pret-a-Manger, for example, we're passionate about food. Well, it was a way in which a language, I felt, was being borrowed to apply to something that, you know, I mean, passion has always been understood to be something about, you know, romantic love, but now it's now a major corporation selling us sandwiches. But my point, I think, is that how you motivate people to great effort in their work became a real preoccupation of management theorists in the sort of late 1990s, and out of that grew this whole kind of brand culture as a kind of form of religion. Actually, it was a kind of set of values. And vocation is an older language, but all of them are about driving great commitment. And is that always exploitative? Well, no, it's not always exploitative. It's sometimes exploitative. So you can see why I want a map, because I want to see where the Venn diagrams, kind of where things overlap, where the conflicts are. I don't think there is an inherent problem about motivating somebody with a sense of purpose in their working lives. On the contrary, it's a really, really valuable thing to do. We benefit as human beings from having a sense of purpose and having an understanding of the value of our work and being motivated to do our very best at that and possibly to exceed our own expectations in the process. So all of that is actually really conducive to you know, the kind of value of work, of our job. And I think that the how financial remuneration fits into that, and then how professions feel that they are listened to in terms of how their work is organized, how their teams are organized, what kinds of forms of authority and discipline there are within those organizations. You know, that's a whole other area of where there is a possibility of exploitation. So, oh my God, is this kind of complex? But I don't think that using the word vocation necessarily takes you into the territory of exploitation.
No, thank you, Madeleine. I would tend to agree with that. Thank you. Other comments, questions, please? We just have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, leading on from what Anne said, I'm Lois, one of the students, and I just thought it was interesting how you was talking about the Care as Our Business poster, and I just wondered what you thought the balance should be between being aware that it's a very emotional role to be in and task to complete, but also being aware that it actually is a means of income and kind of needs to run in the way an operational business would in some aspects. But yeah, I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, Lois, because like Lauren, you've taken us right into another of these kind of cultural conflicts that nurses have to navigate, which is between emotion and reason. So, you know, the hundreds of years of Western history has been, you know, that somehow these sit in different places. You're either reasonable or you're emotional. And of course, women have a tendency to be emotional, has been the conclusion for centuries, and men have a tendency to be reasonable. You can see the kind of patriarchal bias here. I'm sorry, but you know, this is where my feminism gets the better of me, because I don't know how many men I've met who are deeply emotional and terribly unreasonable, and women are the ones that are reasonable. But how do we integrate these two human capabilities? Because of course our reason is useful. And the last thing I want is a nurse who's all emotional. I really hope she's got a good, and he's got a good head on their heads when I arrive in a hospital bed. And you're absolutely right. The thing about nursing is that in many ways, a good nurse has, you know, a good ward sister has probably more in common with a lieutenant colonel in the army or something. You know, it's a job which requires logistic planning. Lots of different things have to happen in the right order at the right time of day. You know, drugs rounds, bedpans, washing, food, you know, and that's just the sort of, you know, just a bit of it. The constant monitoring, supervision, the managing of a complex group of people who need to do different tasks. So efficiency is actually something that healthcare has always had to be concerned with. So, you know, in the last 30 years of public sector reform, there's been this great kind of preoccupation with value for money and efficiency. But healthcare has always understood, and any nurse has to absolutely understand efficiency. So the juggling act you've got, that sometimes you absolutely have to be fast because there's a whole number of tasks that you have to do as a nurse, and they have to get done in a certain time, and it's a very busy shift. And how can you find within that the odd moment where it may be really, really helpful to somebody to just find a moment to pause and reassure? Well, I mean, that's the skill, that's the art. And the nurses that I spoke to had thought a lot about that, reflected over the course of their careers as to what that looked like. Being efficient with their attention is how one nurse described it to me. She said, if I spend too long with one patient, I'm depriving another. So I have to work out what attention I give to who and when. So it's not all about sitting forever beside the bed. I mean, you'll know that it's impossible. You can't do it. You can't hold someone's hand and stroke them. No. You have to leave that to the relatives. The nurse's job does not have that sort of lots of time. It's always very fast paced. So I'm probably just pointing out things that you know all too well. But I think the fact that you're nursing is always straddling that dichotomy between reason and emotion, and is having the skill. I mean, I do think it's a skill. It's an art. It's a dance between the two. You know, that you require both, and our culture has historically not understood that the two can work in tandem. It's not understood the relationship between those two. So that's, again, you know, like I said to Lauren, it's about how you are pioneers. You're on a front line. You're having to almost teach people something they've never thought about before. That actually, I'm a woman, and I'm clever, and I'm skillful, and I'm in authority here, and I have power. You know, some patients that are arriving in the beds will not be used to any of that. and will find it profoundly unfamiliar. So can you see how many different ways? I mean, you know, the whole role of nursing has a very important role of education about people's own self-care. But actually, there's all kinds of social, cultural things that you may find yourself suddenly having to play an educative type role. God, I must say, I listen to myself and I think I'm making the job sound so complicated.
No, I think I completely agree with you, Madeleine, and that I guess the more efficient a ward is, the more space it creates for nurses to fulfill that emotional role that they need to.
Yeah, well done.
No, thank you, Lou. Brilliant question and great. I love this idea of being efficient with the attention. I mean, it moves into ethics as well, with distributive justice and the critical thinking required as to how much time you spend with each person and all of that. And that's yeah, very much an everyday matter. Okay, thank you. We're coming with 5 minutes left, so we're coming up to the end, but we can take a few more comments and questions. Any other comments, questions, please? I'm aware Christopher might have a question. Christopher's been involved in the history of nursing of late, so Christopher, do feel free if you would like to say anything or ask any questions, or indeed anyone else on the call. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Am I being, as I'm heard? Yeah. Madeleine, I've been thinking, I mean, it was a wonderful presentation, thank you. Been thinking about this relationship between the disconnect between nursing and pay. And in terms of history, of course, with amazing people like Florence Nightingale and Louisa Twining and so on, they were upmarket women who didn't need financially to work. And what you haven't mentioned at any point is the role of class in nursing and the way nursing is still perceived. And I suspect that we're beginning to lose that notion that class is still remains one of the most formative and powerful influences within the caring professions. So the healthcare assistant isn't paid well because either consciously or unconsciously, she's seen as lower working class. I offer that thought.
There's so many different sort of ways to think about class in nursing, because one of the interesting things is that Florence Nightingale designed nursing as a profession that respectable women could go into. So from the outset, she was thinking about how middle-class women who had no who had no other means of financial support could actually find this as a respectable way of earning a living. That's my sort of understanding of my reading of of her history. So she I think was very interested in class, actually, and she was trying to broaden the class of nursing, because nursing had previously been largely very sort of poorly trained, working class, large amounts of alcoholism, as you know, the kind of sort of Dickensian type horror stories of the 18th century. And she made it a respectable job, which is why half my convent boarding school in the 70s expected the pupils to become nurses. And indeed, that's precisely what happened, as I understand it, amongst my cohort, certainly. So it did become a profession, a respectable profession. So within nursing, of course, there was a class hierarchy. And you're absolutely right that those with lower educational qualifications and then ended up being working class. The interesting thing about nursing, I think, is it's been one of the most powerful routes of social mobility for women in the last 50 years. And you can see that going on all the time, particularly in London, where there are large numbers of ethnic minority nurses, and they can qualify, get more and more qualifications and move up the ladder. So I'm kind of fascinated by that history of social mobility within nursing. I agree with you that some of the class differentiation within nursing reflects that class differentiation within British society, where we have always had chronic low pay in this country in a way that some European countries don't have, and that reflects the inequality of UK society. Yeah, you know, there's probably more to be said on this subject as well. I'm just sort of thinking about it. The social mobility side of it is always, you know, is really intriguing and very important. And my understanding is that you know, that's always been understood to be important. So the routes for how people can train on the job. I mean, the ward sister that I shadowed had been working in a shop. She finished school at 16. She was working in a shop. She thought she'd try healthcare assistant, and she, you know, was obviously highly intelligent, and she had worked her way up to being a very, very, very competent ward sister in an astonishingly short period of time. She was still, you know, in her early 30s. So within 10 years, she'd gone from healthcare assistant. So those kinds of routes through nursing, so that, you know, it's not just dependent on that sort of one-off chance at 18, whether you've got the right A-levels type of thing.
With much regret, I have to draw this to a close. It was fantastic, Madeleine. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to leave it with "to be continued," because I think, well, I think we'd all agree we'd love to have you come to Exeter in person.
Oh, so that'd be great.
It'd be fantastic. So let's look at the autumn. You're doing that. We'll make a spot, and then we can treat you to dinner and reward.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the questions. I mean, you know, all of those that is still on screen, still here, you know, wonderful questions. I really enjoyed hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much from all of us, and we'll keep in touch, and I'll drop you an email after. Some of us unfortunately have to move on to another Zoom. We're zoomed out, but thank you. And you can see on the side, I don't know if you can see the chat, but we have lots of thank yous, and thank you very much. Fascinating discussion.
Great. Thanks, everybody. That's lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to the next opportunity. Thank you, Madeleine. Just
bye-bye, Anne. Bye-bye.
Thank you.